Hello, I'm Brian Canfield, and today we're going to unravel more mysteries of stained glass. When I have a client come into the studio, typically they have something in mind that they want. And going from that conceptual idea to the finished design and the finished project, that's a big journey. The most important aspect of that journey is the design phase, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. In particular, we call it cartooning. It's drawing out the full-size cartoon, and that then acts as the blueprint to get the stained glass project done in the end. The first thing that we like to start with is what we call a scaled rendering. And over to my left, I have a couple examples of renderings. Now, when I have a client come into the studio, again, they'll have an idea of maybe what they want. But before we get into the subject matter or what they actually have in mind, I like to discuss site-specific details, such as, the architecture of the building, how the lighting may be, is it inside, is it need a light box, or does it have daylight coming through? Once we discuss some of those details and I take some measurements, then I can actually start drawing something that the client can take a look at and say, well, we either like that or we don't. That's a very important part of the process. And this rendering then is the first stage. Once I have an idea of what they want, I'll use a scale ruler, and I like to use a 1 inch to 1 foot ratio. I feel that that really gives a good relationship of the objects and how it might be perceived as a full-size window. So if we look at this is pretty much the first phase where I'll start to draw out some ideas in pencil. And again, this is scaled 1 inch to 1 foot. So if I took a measurement of this rendering, I could get an idea of how big it's going to be. If I find the appropriate ratio here, I can take a measurement of the side, and that's telling me that it's about 10 feet and 6 inches vertically. And then I take the horizontal measurement, and that's about 8 feet wide. Now that's a pretty big window, and this is somewhat of a small drawing, but for me to make changes, it's much easier on this small scaled rendering. Now I do start in pencil, and I can erase as I go, but once I get a good idea of what they want and the client seems to be happy, then I start to add some color. I personally like to use watercolor when I start to add color to the rendering, because watercolor seems to have that glass kind of illuminated feel. Now, not to say that you can't use tempera paint or acrylic or even colored pencils, watercolor like I use. It doesn't matter, but nonetheless, you got to start putting down some color. And if we look at this triptych window, it's segmented into 3 segments. The dark lines are representational of the lead lines. Notice they're a little thicker because, of course, we're going to use about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch lead. This also gives me a good idea of how I want to create a diminishing landscape in this one in particular. I make sure that objects towards the foreground are a little bit bigger. Objects that go into the background are a little bit smaller, of course, to create that realistic perspective. Also, color-wise, I want to make sure that the colors towards the front, the foreground, are very vibrant, gives that feel that they're closer. And then as it recedes into the background, I want to kind of dull the colors as well. Once the client then sees this rendering and they get a good understanding of what they're going to get, then I'll say we'll meet again once I do the full-size cartoon drawing. That's when now I can take the rendering, I can project it up onto a wall, and then I can start working on the full size. So over here to my right is a full-size cartoon. Let's take a look at this. This cartoon in particular is one panel of 4. And this seems like a big window, full size, but in actuality, this is about a 25 feet tall window. But I don't have enough room in here to show you the whole thing, so I decided just to pull out this one panel. Now, what we see here is, a dove, of course. We have clouds in the background. We have some grapevines down here below. But to the naive eye, this looks like just a black and white drawing. It's really hard to understand maybe where those clouds are relative to some of the background. We do like to do this in charcoal, again thickening up the lines, bringing out some of the icons and some of the objects and subject, and it really gives us a good translation of the stained glass project. Now, to the artist, I can see the color in this. I can see the clouds, and I have an idea of what kind of glass I want to use. I can see the dove. I can, in my mind, see that glass that I want to use. But again, when a client looks at this, really I'm trying to get them to see the relationship between the subject and the objects, for them to kind of get an understanding of what their window might look like. But again, they have to put that artistic liberty in my hands and trust in that, you know, I know what I'm doing, and in the end it's going to look all right. But I really like to bring the clients in and get their opinion along the way. It makes it a little more personable for them. And also, you know, of course, I want to make something that they ultimately like in the end. Now, this full-size cartoon, I'd like to show some of the details in the next phase, because this is just the layout. Now I need to add some numbers, I need to add the color strategy, and also some of the texture movement. So I'm going to move to a much smaller drawing, that way we can look at some of the details in this cartoon. So moving over to the Elmo, I have what is probably the most important thing to start with, and that is the full size of the drawing. The full size is the perimeter, the outside edge, the biggest line, the biggest outer edge of any window. It can be square, it can be circular, it doesn't matter, but you get your full size by taking measurements of maybe where the window is going to go in. And of course, if you draw anything bigger than the full size of that opening, your window's not going to fit in. So this full size is incredibly important to be accurate. And to be accurate, you know, you really need to get comfortable with using rulers, systems of measurement. You really need to get comfortable with using some drafting tools such as squares. You saw me drawing the full size with a square. In addition, having things like French curves. You know, I can't draw a straight line, you know, just freehand. I need to have a straight edge. Again, also drawing some of these nice curves. If I have a French curve, that really helps me get a nice, better curve rather than doing it freehand. Another tool I like to use is a compass, of course. Can't draw a freehand circle, might as well use a compass. And also some dividers are good to use. This looks like a compass, but this is just allows me to get particular divisions within a drawing as well. So get comfortable with drafting tools. That's the premise on that one. So when I start to draw a full-size cartoon, and this is going to be a full-size cartoon for stained glass, therefore I'll be using lead in the entire project. With the perimeter, putting in identifying the lead that you're going to use is the next most important step. Because if we know anything about lead, you know, there's three things in particular we need to consider: the outside edge of the lead, the heart of the lead, and also the daylight of the lead. So here I have a 1/2 inch piece. You know, you could use 3/4 inch cane, which we call lead cane. And I'm going to actually take the physical piece of lead, line it up to my full size, and I'm going to start putting in lines where I know my daylight's going to be, and I can see the heart in there, and I'm going to put a line on each end. So I'm going to go all the way around this particular full size drawing and put in my appropriate lines. Now, to save some time, I'm not actually going to go all the way around it, but now I'm going to connect the dots. My cut line here, which is indicative of where the glass is actually going to go. And then this is my daylight, which is indicative of where the illumination starts and stops. Both very important when doing your drawings, because internal structure and the overall feel of this window is dictated by these outside lines. Now when I have a piece of glass and it goes inside of this lead, notice that it stops. Well, if I can get that piece in there. It stops, get a smaller piece, right at that heart. So you can see when I cut my glass and it goes inside of that lead, that cut line is where the glass is going to be. That you absolutely have to draw that in. Now notice also the daylight. This is this outside line. This is where the glass stops and the lead starts. That's where the illumination starts and stops as well. That is a very important line to consider. So we have the full size on the outside. We have the cut line, which is indicative of the heart. And we have the daylight, where the illumination starts and stops. Now, why do we have to consider this? Well, when I start to draw in my objects or whatever, here I have a French curve, I want to draw from the daylight. Because if I draw anything outside of that daylight, once I start letting my project, it's going to cut off that line. So if I'm drawing a tree, or if I have a face or a hand or something that's close to the edge, if I don't draw it to the daylight and I happen to draw it maybe to the full size or the cut line, once I put that lead on there, it's completely going to cut off maybe an ear or maybe something that's very important. So always draw to the daylight. Now I'm going to put in some arbitrary lines here that are just going to be representational of a stained glass window. If you're going to put in things like bevels, take that bevel out of the package, put it down on a piece of paper, and draw around it. Do not assume that the pre-made, pre-manufactured pieces are perfect. Now I can cut that bevel off, no problem. Put in a nice rondelle here. I don't like that one. Maybe I'll use this one a little smaller. I can cut that rondelle down. I'll put it down here in this corner, drawing to the daylight. Now I'm starting to get some fields of color here. Now, once I start analyzing this drawing, I need to consider my limitations of glass, because we know that glass, if you were to cut this piece out, there's no way that that would be structurally sound. Cutting in a 90-degree angle here into this piece, that is just not going to work. So in stained glass, we see all these somewhat arbitrary lines, but in reality, those lines are usually functional in that they're going to divide up the glass so that it's structurally sound and you're not compromising the glass. So this seems like a very simplistic window. It is to a certain degree, but now I need to move on to the next stage of the design. I have my objects in different forms in here. Now I need to start numbering them, because we know that stained glass, it's kind of like a puzzle. And there's a number 1 piece, a number 2 piece, so on and so forth. Do not assume that any of those are interchangeable, because the number 9 is only going to fit where the number 9 piece goes, regardless if it looks like it's going to fit anywhere else. So now that I've got everything numbered, now I need to start considering color. And when you look in a sample pack, let's say, of a stained glass company that makes glass, usually they're going to have some sort of sticker on it. This is Kokomo opalescent glass, one of my favorite glass to use in stained glass. And a lot of times it's going to have all these different numbers and all these different nomenclatures. And that's a lot of stuff to write in each field. So what I like to do is I like to make a color strategy. So let's say I'm just going to use 2 different oranges here. 2 different companies. One is Kokomo. It is a 125 7 LLG. Wow, that's a lot to write. You know what? I'm just going to make a note saying this is O for orange. And notice that these 2 are a little different in color, but most importantly, notice they have a little different texture as well. The one has surface texture, the other one's nice and smooth. Now later on, that's something that we also need to indicate. But before we go into that, we'll finish my color strategy. So there's one color. My other one I'm just going to say is L for Lambert's, 23960. And I'm just going to say this is a light orange. So I have orange, which has texture, and then LO for light orange. Now I need to start putting in the color fields. And I'm going to circle the color. LO here, circle it, orange here, and I'm just going to kind of go in and arbitrarily put these in. Now I want to kind of create a sense of push and pull with these, so I want to variegate them up a little bit. The texture is going to create some contrast. And also the tone will create a little contrast there as well. Seems like a pretty simple window with just two colors, but I think it'll be quite vibrant. Now another thing that we need to really consider is this texture. Now on this one I can put this piece of glass in any way that I want, and it really isn't going to affect the way that my eye moves across the piece, because there's really no texture, very little striations, but nothing really apparent to the eye. Now with this piece, the regular orange piece, it has a lot of surface texture, and look, there's actually movement from that texture. So why not utilize that as a design element in the stained glass piece? You know, if I have this moving vertically, that's going to give me a different feel. If I have that moving diagonally, that's a little more energetic. It's going to give me a different feel, and of course horizontally it's going to give me a different feel. So to indicate texture, I like to put two parallel lines, and going that way, going that way. You know what? I realized that's in the wrong field. So I'm looking for just the O's and placing those textured lines. So when I now go to cut out the patterns, when I make copies, then I'm able to take these templates, line them up on the glass appropriately, making sure that the parallel lines are moving with the texture, and I'm able to create that sense of design utilizing the texture. So moving back over to the rendering then, if I look at this a little closer, thinking about texture, thinking about color, when I go to draw this full size, you know, putting in those texture lines, I'm really going to be able to achieve this movement within the cliffs. You know, this kind of diagonal vertical movement. Also look at this cliff right here. Again, you need that diagonal vertical movement. Maybe you have some water moving from the background to the foreground. Lining up textured glass, such as maybe water glass, you're really going to be able to achieve great depth and great character of design by not only utilizing the color, but also utilizing the texture. So this is the basic design phase. And again, I would have that client come in and check over everything and look at everything. But with this blueprint, once they say, yeah, this is what I like, this rendering, and then moving on to that full-scale drawing, yes, this is what I like, move on. Now, when I finish this project, I really have a better sense that they're going to like it, I'm going to like it, and it's going to work for the space overall. That's it for design. I hope to see you back. I'm Brian Canfield. Goodbye.